meet the recovery needs of crime victims rather than simply talking about crime victims. We've passed bills to provide services for domestic violence victims. I created a new crime victim and community safety services initiative with $100,000 for each council member's district. And we established New York State's first trauma recovery centers in our city to help survivors of violence in communities recover and stop cycles of violence. These and much more are essential to ensuring our communities are safe. But we know disparate impacts on Black communities, Latino communities, and other communities of color. Police accountability and transparency are also prerequisites to public safety in our city. Increased access to policing data has been at the center of making our city safer for decades. Police transparency is also pivotal to the trust with communities that is necessary to improve safety and to help solve crime. Yesterday, the governor signed into law the bill creating a reparations commission, acknowledging the legacy of slavery on our city and communities and starting efforts to address it. Similarly, we also must realize the legacy of policing in certain communities and how its experiences with policing differ from other communities. The city's use of stop and frisk that disproportionately affected Black and Latino communities and was ruled unconstitutional by a federal court was a recognition of these experiences. As the federal monitor established by this court decision has repeatedly reported, the NYPD continues to under-report stops and unlawful stops where severe disparities among Black and Latino communities persist. We cannot ignore these realities and the work that remains for us to address them. People in our communities are conditioned to be stopped by police at the various levels, including what are considered to be level 1 stops, where ID can be requested without an individual having done something wrong or even suspected of doing anything wrong. The reality is that these different levels of stops can be experienced without any practical distinction for the person who is stopped. The trauma and conditioning related to these stops have an impact on the relationship and trust communities have with police, particularly when they occur with no transparency. They can be intrusive, and they can be disruptive to the daily lives of residents, students, and essential frontline workers like teachers and nurses. And they should not happen in the shadows. We have to realize and respect those experiences, even if they are not our own. We can't ignore the impact they have on public safety. It is our job to contend with the legacies of harm in our communities that impact the lives of generations of Black and Latino New Yorkers and repair them. Accountability and transparency are important pathways to advance that goal, and we must foster thoughtful conversations to facilitate progress rather than those who disregard the serious experiences and issues of community members. As the most diverse council in this city's history, it's important that our actions are consistent with what our communities need. That's why we've advanced solutions to address long-standing issues in our city that hinder the health, safety, and well-being of too many communities. We must not trap ourselves into maintaining a status quo that fights change and does not benefit the diverse communities of this city. Progress is the sign of a healthy democracy. It's what New Yorkers deserve and what this council has focused on delivering. Now let's dive into our stated agenda. First, we'll vote on the following finance items: a transparency resolution approving new designations and changes of certain organizations receiving funding in the expense budget, An amendment to an existing Article 5 exemption and renewal of a partial 40-year Article 5 exemption for 3 buildings in Councilmember Abreu's district. And a full 40-year Article 11 expansion for the preservation of 8 buildings in Councilmember Richardson Jordan's and De La Rosa's districts. These buildings collectively contain 195 units. Next, we'll vote on the following land use items. 506 West 135th Street, ANCP, a UDAP approval, disposition of city-owned property, and an Article 11 tax exemption to facilitate the renovation and preservation of 3 city-owned buildings into approximately 63 affordable cooperative homeownership units in Councilmember Abreu's district. West 120 through 126th Street, ANCP cluster, a UDAP approval, disposition of city-owned property, and an Article 11 tax exemption to facilitate the renovation and preservation of 4 city-owned buildings. It will include approximately 48 affordable cooperative homeowner units, along with commercial and community space in Councilmember Richardson Jordan's district. Linden Gardens, a UDAP approval, disposition of city-owned property, and an Article 11 tax exemption to facilitate 37 affordable cooperative homeownership units in Councilmember Nurse and Barron's districts. New Penn Article 11, an Article 11 tax exemption request to facilitate the development of 10 new residential buildings with 71 affordable rental units in Councilmember Barron's district. We're also voting on the site selections for a new approximately 696-seat primary school in Councilmember Ung's district and a new approximately 676-seat high school, including District 75 special education seats in Councilmember Brannon's district. And 541 through 545 Bay Street rezoning will facilitate the development of a new mixed-use building that includes approximately 81 housing units, 25 of which will be permanently affordable, as well as ground floor commercial space and approximately 42 parking spaces in Councilmember Hank's district. The council is modifying the application to remove the MIA to workforce option. Today, we will vote on the following resolutions. Resolution 837, sponsored by Councilmember Robert Holden, would call on the New York State Legislature to pass and the governor to sign S.4717, A.3149, to authorize the New York State Department of Veterans Services to provide eligible veterans with financial assistance for purchasing, training, and the upkeep of service dogs and emotional support dogs. Resolution 584, sponsored by Councilmember Linda Lee, would call on the state legislature to pass and the governor to sign legislation to enter 3 interstate licensure compacts to help medical and mental health providers become licensed in multiple participating states. Resolution 863 that I am proposing would condemn recent attacks on members of the Sikh community in New York City and call for an end to discrimination against Sikh New Yorkers. Resolution 473, sponsored by Councilmember Tiffany Caban, would call on the state legislature to pass and the governor to sign S.1099, A.1963, which would protect youth during custodial police interrogations. Resolution 556B, sponsored by Councilmember Crystal Hudson, would call on the state legislature to pass and the governor to sign the Access to Representation Act, which establishes the right to legal counsel in immigration court proceedings. And Resolution 241A, also sponsored by Councilmember Crystal Hudson, would call on the state legislature to pass and the governor to sign the Fair and Timely Parole Act, which would ensure that the parole release process is based on rehabilitation and risk to public safety, and the Elder Parole Act, which would establish parole consideration for people at least 55 years old who have served 15 consecutive years in prison. Today, we'll also vote on the following pieces of legislation. Introduction 532A, sponsored by Councilmember James Gennaro, would require the Department of Environmental Protection to report on the additional construction and installation needed to establish the city's coastal bodies of water as vessel no-discharge zones and to install at least 2 pump-out facilities per year until all coastal water bodies are designated as no-discharge zones. Councilmember Gennaro could not join us today, but we do thank him for his work on his legislation. Introduction 1139A, sponsored by Councilmember Amanda Farias, would allow advertising on the interior of for-hire vehicles, and I invite Councilmember Farias to discuss her legislation.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, for the introduction. I'm Councilmember Amanda Farias, and I'm excited that today the City Council will be passing my bill, Introduction 1139A. This legislation has had a long time awaited arrival, since 2018, actually. The bill allows for drivers to opt into interior advertising in for-hire vehicles, providing drivers with an opportunity to earn a passive income on the advertisements, allowing for an additional avenue of revenue for our hardworking drivers. Additionally, it creates a bridge between the driver and their clients through personalized questions to learn more about them, creating a more positive and safe work environment. It has also been shown that when clients are presented with a visible reminder to tip their driver on in-car infotainment screens, drivers have seen a 13% increase on the tips received. New York City is home to roughly 100,000 rideshare drivers, and our rideshare economy has provided and continues to provide a huge opportunity for working class and immigrant communities to have financial stability and upward economic mobility for themselves and their families. Some of you may be asking, why did I introduce this bill? Why does the City Council decide if our drivers get to have in-car advertising or not? The New York City Taxi Limousine Commission regulates interior and exterior vehicle advertising, and over the last 5 years, drivers have been subject to the slow bureaucratic process. Advertising was not only allowed for a short period of time between issuing permits in 2018 and closing of them in July of 2019. This left an incredibly small window for drivers to legally gain extra revenue, and therefore was a huge missed opportunity for them and our local economy. What makes today so important is that drivers will no longer be subject to TLC policy changes, and their opportunity for advertising will be cemented into law for years to come. The ability for drivers, specifically that service our outer borough communities, to have advertisement in their cars comes at an urgent moment, with more fees incoming to our drivers in communities like mine in the Southeast Bronx due to rising gas prices, congestion pricing, and the upcoming Green Rides initiative. The revenue sharing model outlined within this bill will allow drivers to truly reap the benefits of the ad revenue, and they will earn 25% of the revenue generated by the ads played on the tablets. The rideshare sector is not only a huge opportunity for hardworking people, but it is also a key part of our city's economy, transit systems, and is an essential part of so many New Yorkers' day-to-day lives. This bill puts New York City rideshare drivers first, and I'm incredibly proud to have gotten this done for drivers in just 4 months before our legislative session. Thank you so much to the Speaker and to Chair Brooks Powers for seeing it through to the end. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Introduction 1278, sponsored by Councilmember Shekhar Krishnan, would co-name 117 thoroughfares and public spaces based on requests of council members. I thank Councilmember Krishnan for his work on this legislation. Introduction 1048A, sponsored by Councilmember Julie Wan, would require the city's chief procurement officer to establish a secure electronic document vault to store procurement-related records. I invite Councilmember Wan to talk about her legislation.
Thank you. Good morning. It's so good to see you all. My name is Julie Wan. Thank you so much to Madam Speaker and the entire legislative team and all of my colleagues for having this happen today. So for Intro 1048, this is a bill that seeks to address major bureaucratic hurdles faced by our nonprofit partners and human service providers across New York City. The burden of repeatedly submitting the same duplicative paperwork to multiple city agencies when bidding on city contracts is unconscionable. Whether it's certificates, organizational documents, financial statements, or other materials, nonprofit organizations are spending an inordinate amount of time, while it delays payments as well as procurement processes, and this represents wasted efforts that do nothing to help our vulnerable New Yorkers to vital services, which is what these contracts are for. So by establishing a centralized and secure electronic document vault, Intro 1048A provides 21st century solution allowing providers to simply refer to agencies' required documents already submitted and stored digitally in one consolidated document repository. So this is essentially like a common application for colleges that you would for contracts, where now no longer does one agency require, multiple agencies require you to upload the same document multiple times for these nonprofits, but instead you upload it once and you can refer to them, all the agencies, to that place. So streamlining and consolidating documents in this common sense way alleviates headaches for vendors and our agencies, and it'll also free up precious time and resources for our nonprofits to focus on doing the actual human services work to help everyday New Yorkers instead of doing administrative work. And it'll also help as we continue to see a lot of issues come up with our emergency contracting or the migrant crisis contracts with DocGo and others. This will allow nonprofits to have an equal footing to compete in this space so that they can get their work done. So thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing this pass.
Thank you. Introduction 563A, sponsored by Councilmember Gail Brewer, would add the right to file a private civil action to the Earn Safe and Sick Time Act, which allows most private employees in New York City to earn paid safe and sick time from their employers. I invite Councilmember Brewer to talk about the importance of her legislation.
Thank you very much. I am talking about 563A, and I am Gail Brewer. And I am pleased that the council is voting on legislation to add a private right of action provision to the Earn Safe and Sick Time Act. I call it the Paid Sick Time Act. Nearly 2/3 of the paid sick time laws across the country have a private right of action, including the New York State. Today's vote coincides with the 10th anniversary of the passage of the city's Earned Sick Time Law, which I introduced and fought for alongside an incredible coalition to guarantee paid time off for then 3.4 million private sector workers across New York, including 1.2 million workers who had no access, none, to paid sick time before the law was passed in 2013, and thank goodness it did because it was used during the pandemic. There's a critical need for a private right of action. Let me be clear. One, when workers lose their jobs because they took protected sick time, equitable relief is much more readily available in court. Two, workers who experience paid sick time violations often have additional claims, including wage and hour violations. It is easier to seek remedies for multiple types of violations at the same time in a single court action. And third, a paid sick class action involving numerous workers facing similar violations is only an option in court. I certainly want to thank my Chief of Staff, Schuler Warren Puder, who negotiated this and the paid sick time many years ago, and Sam Goldsmith from my office, Jeff Baker, the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection, Ria Ogasawara, Jeremy John, Faiza Ali, obviously Carmen De La Rosa, head of the committee, and definitely the Partnership Hospitality Alliance and A Better Balance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, Introduction 145, sponsored by Councilmember Justin Brannan, would require the Department of Sanitation to assist the Department of Parks and Recreation with the removal of fallen tree debris from streets after severe weather. Councilmember Brannan couldn't join us today, but we do thank him for his work on this legislation. Introduction 1131A, sponsored by Councilmember Rafael Salamanca, would require the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to perform 6 months of outreach to anyone operating a mobile car wash regarding licensing requirements and related penalties. I invite Councilmember Salamanca to the podium to speak about his legislation.
All right, thank you, Madam Speaker. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to speak on this legislation that speaks to a citywide issue being experienced in all 5 boroughs. As Speaker Adams detailed, Intro 1131 takes a two-folded approach in regulating an industry that has largely gone unchecked by city agencies in its current form. Under Intro 1131, enforcement oversight of mobile car washes would be expanded to include the Department of Sanitation, giving them the ability to issue summonses to vendors who are operating illegally without a valid car wash license, while also allowing them to tow vehicles if they're blocking a fire hydrant, releasing chemicals on city streets, or littering on city right-of-ways. Before sanitation expanded enforcement begins in July of 2024, Intro 1131 also creates a mandatory 6 months in-person outreach campaign to be undertaken by the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection to notify vendors of the impending enforcement changes and ways to get licensed working with their agency. As I mentioned, mobile car wash industry has turned into the Wild Wild West. Despite a requirement that all mobile car vendors be licensed, the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection has only issued 15 licenses to date. Given that extremely low, it is no exaggeration to say that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of mobile car wash vendors who are operating illegally. As we explore making that unrealistic licensing process more vendor-friendly, Intro 1131 is an important first step in making sure vendors are educated on the rules and regulations surrounding their industry, while tasking the agency who has the manpower to enforce the ability to regulate the bad actors who are causing quality of life issues. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to speak on this Intro 1131, and I want to thank my colleagues for supporting this bill.
Introduction 946A, sponsored by Yankee fan council. I'm sorry, I almost got you up there. Sponsored by, it's 1161, sponsored by Council Member Sean Abreu, would prohibit professional and collegiate sports venues from barring ticket holders from bringing in a reusable beverage container that is made of aluminum or stainless steel and holds 24 fluid ounces or less. I invite Council Member Abreu to talk about his legislation. Go Mets.
Go Yankees, everybody. I want to thank you, Madam Speaker, for your commitment to cleaning up our streets and hitting our zero waste goals. I'll only be a minute. Yet by the time I'm done with my remarks, Americans will have purchased 1 million disposable plastic bottles. This addiction to plastic has put our environment in peril. Water bottles lie in our streets, they have flooded our rivers, and they sit in landfill for hundreds of years. Today, this council is taking a crucial step towards striking out plastic waste by requiring all professional and collegiate sport venues across our city to allow fans to bring reusable water bottles into events. If we want people to adopt good habits, we have to make it easy for them, and that's what we're doing today. This bill will eliminate thousands of disposable bottles from stadiums every year and make it a little cheaper for fans to enjoy a game without having to pay $10 for something they can get free from the tap. This is a win for our fans, it's a win for our iconic sport venues, and it's a win for our planet. While it'll always be the Yankees for me, whatever your team is, you can now cheer them on with your reusable water bottle. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Nice. Thank you, Council Member. Introduction 946A, sponsored by Council Member Crystal Hudson, would require each city agency to have a mental health coordinator to assist and perform outreach to city employees about mental health and support services available to them. Council Member Hudson will be speaking about her legislation later on at the press conference. Introduction 542, sponsored by Council Member Mercedes Narcisse, would require DOE, ACS, and DOC to issue annual reports on educational programming for at-risk and juvenile-involved youth and to post these reports on their respective websites. The reports would include statistics on educational programming enrollment, available services, rates of violence, and other indicators. And next, we'll be voting on a package of legislation aimed at addressing the mental health and needs of veterans. These bills are the second part of the Council's mental health roadmap, a comprehensive and ongoing plan to improve mental health outcomes for New Yorkers. Introduction 1241, sponsored by Councilmember Mercedes Narcisse, would require the Department of Veterans Services to submit to the Council and post on its website an annual report summarizing the mental health services offered and provided by city agencies to veterans and the number of veterans who have applied for and received mental health services. I invite Councilmember Narcisse to discuss both of her bills.
Good afternoon, and before I start, I have to say thank you to Madam Speaker for being the leader that you are. For the past 2 years, almost 2 years now, since we've been in this process, and today I swear in again. So I'm looking forward to work in partnership, in collaboration with my colleagues. And I'm very impressed throughout the process how we've been fighting and bring in the forefront bills that can make changes in our community, in our city. So I'm excited to be on the verge of passing 2 bills which will help us better serve 2 of our city's most vulnerable and often underserved communities. NGO 542 will require the Department of Education and the Administration for Children's Services to report on educational programming for juvenile delinquents, juvenile offenders, and adolescent offenders. This is a vital step towards ensuring that both education and rehabilitation are at the forefront of our city's juvenile system. By requiring the Department of Education and Administration of Children's Services to report on educational programming will help transform these vulnerable lives through education, accountability, and quality care. Children, young folks, everyone make mistakes. So that's our opportunity in the city of New York to say that I see you. I realize you made a mistake. So now I'm creating an opportunity for you to come back to society and serve your society. And so 1241A will require the Commissioner of Veteran Services to submit an annual report on the provision of mental health services by city agencies to veterans. Our veterans have served our nation with distinction, and it is our duty to ensure that they will receive the support and services they have earned and deserve. Suicide and mental health distress disproportionately affect veterans in the United States. And in our city, we have to do better. We must do better for our veterans. And recent studies show that more than half of all veterans experiencing a mental health condition are not receiving timely treatment. An annual report by the Commissioner of Veteran Services will help us better understanding the needs of our veterans, thus being able to provide them with the best possible mental health services while improving their overall quality of life. What is the better way to do that? Those folks that fought for our freedom in the United States of America and our city. So thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, my colleagues, and I'm looking forward for this bill to come through. Thank you.
Thank you. Introduction 1237, sponsored by Councilmember Eric Dinowitz, would require any city agency that collects demographic information through form documents from individuals seeking social services in the city to offer a standardized and voluntary survey asking demographic questions related to veteran status. I invite Councilmember Dinowitz to the podium to discuss his legislation.
Thank you. I'm Eric Dinowitz, council member for the 11th District in the Bronx, where the Yankees play. It's just a better team, usually. And I'm proud to be up here for 1237, of course, along on the second stop of the Mental Health Roadmap with Speaker Adams, with Councilmembers Narcisse and Lee. You know, in our city, we have over 200,000 veterans plus their family members. And supporting our veterans was something I think growing up, we didn't hear a lot about, and me personally, it wasn't until I became chair of the Veterans Committee, which I chaired last term, that I had the honor of meeting veterans from every war, from World War II to Afghanistan and everything in between. And, you know, our veterans are individuals who chose to sacrifice of their time, and in some cases, potentially their lives, to make sure that we were all safe, that our freedoms were safe, our values were safe, and our physical lives were safe. And in New York City, we care deeply about our veterans, their physical and their mental health, and that's why we're passing legislation today. That's why, as a city, we provide these services to veterans, regardless of discharge status. But there's a fundamental question that we have to be asking. Who are our veterans? What this bill does is it requires our city agencies to ask that very question on any of their forms. And all the outreach we do, all of the services we provide in New York City, they will be better able to do outreach to our veterans, to our communities. We can know who our veterans are and where they are, and provide them the critical support that they've earned. Now, our veterans, they didn't know who exactly they were protecting. They didn't know me or any of us up here, but they were fighting for us. And with this bill, we can know who they are so that we can target and do targeted outreach to them and provide them with the services that they have more than earned. So I once again want to thank Speaker Adams for having me here today, for having this bill come to the floor, and for voting on it today. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that legislation. As one whose dad and husband veterans of the Air Force, I think this is terrific legislation. Thank you, Council Member. Introduction 1244, sponsored by Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, would require the Department of Veterans Services, in coordination with relevant agencies, to develop and distribute an informational pamphlet that describes the department's resources and services. We thank the Public Advocate for his work on this bill. Introduction 1239, sponsored by Councilmember Linda Lee, would require the Department of Veterans Services, in coordination with the Mayor's Community Affairs Unit and the Mayor's Public Engagement Unit, to conduct outreach and a targeted public education campaign regarding the mental health resources available to veterans in the city. I invite Councilmember Lee to discuss her legislation.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, as well as, sorry, and to our colleagues who are here today. And, you know, as Chair of the Mental Health, Disabilities, and Addictions Committee, I'm proud that the City Council will be passing Intro 1239, which would require the Department of Veterans Services, in coordination with the Office of Community Mental Health, to conduct outreach and education and engagement on mental health resources available to veterans. And I think the reason why we decided to focus so much on veterans was because we have seen that they are, as others have mentioned, disproportionately impacted by homelessness, comorbidity with mental health issues, substance use issues, and it is a neglected population that we should really be honoring and that we should really be thanking to, you know, those who have fought for our freedoms in this country. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to roll out this next phase, and I thank you, Speaker, for you know, allowing us to go through this next phase of the mental health roadmap. And the Department of Veterans Services will also provide a website form that allows organizations to submit information about the mental health services that could be provided for veterans. And one of the things that we heard over and over again in the testimonies of veterans that came when we heard this bill is that the biggest barrier to accessing services is really the outreach portion of it. And so, you know, people are not coming forward. It's really hard to find where all the veterans are. And so, you know, they said even if the services are available, they're not plugged into the services. And so I think we really, as a council, felt strongly, you know, this is something we need to try to really make a concerted effort on, to really reach out to those that have served our country so dearly. And so, you know, this is really to make sure that we are trying as best as possible to reach the hard-to-reach populations and veterans and community members. And so I just wanted to thank my staff, the council committee staff, as well as the dedicated efforts of my colleagues on the Committee on Mental Health, Disabilities and Addiction, Committee on Veterans, as well as the leadership of Speaker Adrienne Adams for helping me bring this legislation to the floor. So thank you.
Thank you. Introduction 632A, sponsored by Majority Leader Keith Powers, would amend the city's human rights law to prohibit housing discrimination on the basis of criminal history in New York City, with limited exceptions for certain crimes that are considered reviewable. The passage of this bill has been many years in the making, and I thank Majority Leader Powers for his work refining the legislation. I invite the Majority Leader to speak about this bill.
Try to keep it brief. I know we got a long agenda today. Thank you, everyone, and nice to see you today, and thank you to the Speaker. Very excited to be advancing a major piece of legislation to tackle housing discrimination here in New York City, the Fair Chance for Housing Act. Right now, we have widespread discrimination in the city when it comes to housing on a number of different, for a number of different reasons. I passed a a law a few years ago tackling source of income discrimination to make sure that people, based on the form they're paying, wouldn't be discriminated against. And now we're building on that by talking about people who are ready to rebuild their life, ready to re-enter society, and deserve a second chance. And it's time for our laws to reflect that. And with today's passage of Intro 632A, I believe they finally will. Stable housing is the foundation of a stable life. You can ask any New Yorker about that, and they will agree with that. Without access to housing, formerly incarcerated people struggle to find employment, to maintain their mental and physical health, go back to school, and take care of their families. Roughly 750,000 New Yorkers have a history of conviction, the vast majority of whom are people of color, and they and their families, and I want to stress their families too, face a lifetime of obstacles to housing based on that discrimination. By removing those barriers to housing, people are better able to support themselves, their families, and to make our communities overall safer. The version of the bill that we are voting on here today is a culmination of months or almost over a year plus of ongoing conversations and feedback from advocates, from housing providers, from industry stakeholders, and colleagues, of course, as well. And I am very, very proud of the bill that we are voting on today because it really does reflect all those different conversations, getting people into a room and talking about how to make the best bill possible. And want to thank the speaker and her staff for their support and their thoughtful input all along the way. I also want to thank the folks from the Fair Chance Housing Coalition who fought very hard to make sure that we got to this moment here today. I want to thank the whole team here at the Speaker's office. I want to thank, she's not here, but the chair of the committee, Natasha Williams. I want to thank my staff, Ben and Haley, who didn't just work on this legislation when it got introduced. They worked up until the very last minute, almost nearly midnight of the night that we were putting this bill to lay out an age, but I promise it was before midnight, to make sure that everybody's comments and feedback got included, and that was a big game of telephone on that last few hours. And I want to thank all my colleagues who sponsored this from the outset, but also provided input to it to make sure that it is the best bill. And I was really proud to say we have all the stakeholders on board and very excited about this. And just before I end, I just want to note and recognize my friend and Councilmember Danny Drum, who I know is here for the solitary confinement. You can do that. I'll shut up. But I want to say hello to Danny Drum.
Thank you, Majority Leader. Okay. All right, before we invite the next group of council members to talk about about their legislation, we'll go ahead and take any on-topic questions for this initial group of bills.
Hi, Speaker.
Hi, Morgan.
Thank you. So I have two questions. So the first one for the STOP bill that we're required. Oh, that's the next.
Next, yeah, this is a two for today.
Okay. Love that. And then the solitary confinement bill. Did you guys talk about that?
It's two.
The next one. Oh, I'm so sorry. In fairness, we did mention at the beginning.
Well, in my remarks.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about
Yep,
that.
no problem. Yeah, it's fine.
Any on-topic questions on any of the bills?
Well, I guess with Keith's bill that you just talked about, there was discussion over how clean slate had been passed on the state side. Will there be any, is your bill superfluous as opposed?
No, it's not. In fact, we were making sure that it wasn't. Certainly, there's been bills on clean slate in a similar model where there's years and there's allowances for us to look at information. But we did a couple things. One is we changed the process in when you're going to rent an apartment so that at the like similar to employment now, they can go through the regular process, then ask for it at the very end of the process. That way, a person has an opportunity to say, I have a good credit, I can pay the rent, here's my rent references, here's all the information. Now, then we can have a discussion about that background check. If they still want to use it, there is a window, but for starters, clean slate is 8 years, ours is 5. When you talk about felonies, they have a number of carve-outs, as I understand it, about what they can look at. Ours doesn't. And similarly, we're talking about different sort of topics and categories at the end of the day. We also build out some other provisions as well. I think notably, though, one big add here is like the process-oriented stuff, so that if a landlord does want to use it within the allowable window, that they will do that at the end of the process versus having that as an upfront thing. We want people an opportunity to show, I can pay the rent, I'm a good tenant, I will be a model citizen, and then you can talk about doing that check or not, and landlords will be allowed to do it in those instances where it's within the time frame. Thanks.
I think we're all good with that, and thank you, Councilman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to turn the tide, and as we're doing that now, I will extend a warm welcome home to former Councilmember Danny Drum. Hello. How are you today? Oh, you got the biorhythm memo too.
I missed the memo.
This is just so interesting. So interesting. Hello.
You guys are all channeling Capricorn energy.
Good,
so you know.
good.
It's nice. We have a nice. I'm on this side, so it's balanced.
Yeah, balance.
It's a balance. I thought it was more people. Oh, this is cute. I like this blazer.
Thank you. It's making its debut today.
Yeah, this is my debut dress too. You know, I got sworn in.
So, yes, we did. We all did. Yeah, he did.
Yeah, I'm 2 more years. That's my chance. 2 more years. 2 more years. I'm okay for 2 more years. 2 more years. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think they know.
It really
They
was.
elected me.
There she is. Look at the biorhythms, too.
The what, the brown?
The biorhythms and the brown.
She didn't even know. Look at that.
This is so cool.
She's in. It's the energy.
Felt that energy.
Even Giovanni's matching.
Giovanni's even matching. This is crazy.
Wait, we're missing Carlina. Where's Carlina?
Carlina?
She has a bill?
Has anybody seen Carlina? Yes. Oh, yes, she. It's Alexa. Crystal. I'm missing Crystal.
No, Sophia.
Okay. Good Lord. I'm like, of course. I see you, Crystal.
It's not her fault.
Selvina. I saw her walking around.
Yeah, I don't think anybody told her. But she was still in the.
Okay. All right, so maybe not Carlina. I don't see Carlina in this lineup today. Okay.
Carlina's not on the lineup? Oh, okay.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we've got a lot of work to do. Okay. Introduction 1203A, sponsored by Councilmember Kevin Riley, would require the Department of Correction to provide a letter of incarceration to all individuals as they leave the department's custody that they can use to apply for benefits. I invite Councilmember Riley to the podium to give remarks on his legislation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Many on Rikers are presumed innocent and awaiting trial, within 1 in 5 detainees being held on monetary bail. Every day spent on Rikers is another day harder for an individual to re-enter into society. Intro 1203A marks a pivotal step in our ongoing commitment to rectifying injustices and facilitating the smooth re-entry of incarcerated individuals back into their communities, expanding our efforts to safely and sustainability transform our systematic, unbalanced incarcerated system. This bill acknowledges the DOC's responsibility to provide discharge papers upon release, detailing the date that a person entered and was released from custody. This arms individuals with vital tools that can provide essential services like housing, assistance, and healthcare, which are critical elements to reduce recidivism. I gotta get glasses, I'm getting older now.
That's small print though.
I know, right? I'm here like,
I resemble that.
I know, right?
And I have
Post-verdict, both guilty and innocent individuals encounter hurdles in re-entering into our city's social fabric, such as explaining their absence from the workforce. Discharging papers, regardless of whether they were held pre-trial or where subject to an order of commitment, become essential for accessing public benefits to rebuild their means of support. As we work towards passing this bill today, I urge my colleagues to unite with me in support of a New York City that pioneers the fight against mass incarceration, which we are doing today, champion fairness, accountability, and a pathway to success. I thank my colleagues in government who are co-sponsors on this bill. Thank you.
Introduction 1153A, sponsored by Councilmember Sandy Nurse, would require the Commissioner of Social Services, in consultation with the Police Commissioner, the Commissioner of Sanitation, and the Commissioner of Parks and Recreation, to produce 2 reports every quarter on how many people experiencing homelessness were removed from public spaces, what housing services were offered, and whether there were any involuntary removals or arrests. I invite Councilmember Nurse to the podium to discuss her legislation.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker. Today, we will pass Intro 1153, which is a long overdue bill that will bring transparency and accountability to the city when conducting homeless sweeps, cleanups, or other removals. Being homeless is not a crime. It is not due to personal failure or a reflection on one's moral character. It is a byproduct of a housing system that puts private profit above people's basic needs. For decades, New York City has tried to hide homelessness from the public through sweeps, cleanups, move-alongs, orders, and other practices. These actions are harmful, counterproductive, wasteful, and do nothing to connect people to housing or life-saving services. To put it clearly, we do not need to conduct sweeps or cleanups in order to house or connect people with services. Intro 1153 is simple. It will require regular reporting on homeless removals and shine a light on how removals are initiated, where and how often they occur, agency involvement, how much they cost, how many voluntary hospitalizations occurred through the removal, and if people are actually being offered services. This data will show the full scope and breadth of how our city chooses to hide and criminalize homelessness rather than solve it. Intro 1153 will give us evidence on what is not working and allow us to advocate for better policies like Housing First. I want to thank Ryan Hickey from my team for over a year of working on this. Thank you to the Legal Aid Society, Vocal New York, Mobilization for Justice, Safety Net Project, and the Coalition for the Homeless. Thank you to my co-prime council member, Hanif, for her partnership on this bill, and Speaker Adams for seeing this bill through. Thank you. And congratulations to everyone passing bills this year. It's been such an honor to be in this council with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Nurse. Introduction 3, sponsored by Deputy Speaker Diana Ayala, would regulate the NYPD's response to children in emotional crisis within Department of Education public schools. Specifically, this bill would establish procedures for NYPD personnel responding to children in emotional crisis and limit the use of mechanical restraints on such children. I invite our Deputy Speaker to speak about her legislation.
Thank you. Okay, the moment you've all been waiting for. Everybody looks so quiet today. What's going on in here? I'm rattled by the calmness in the room. But in actuality, this is a very simple bill, but it is intended to correct a wrong that has been brought upon our children for way too many years. It is a common practice in Black and brown communities that children in emotional distress may have a higher likelihood of having 911 called on them, resulting in those same children being restrained in some shape or form. Some kids in handcuffs, and so this bill basically it sets us a standard for what we should be doing in those cases where a child is under emotional distress, and it ensures that if in fact somebody does call 911 and a police officer happens to show up, that certain steps are taken prior to any level of hospitalization or restraining of any child. It does, however, take into account that there may be an emergency situation that requires immediate action, and so this bill in no way, shape, or form prevents the police department from being able to respond expeditiously to such cases, but it really is one that I've worked on for a really long time. This bill will impact many specifically Black young men that are in school, some as young as 5 years old, who are being introduced to the police department in a very negative and traumatic way unnecessarily. Children that are, maybe just having a bad day, as we all do. And this is just a standard that we cannot, continue to allow to happen. So I thank you, all of the members that supported the bill, and I look forward to us passing it today. Thank you.
Thank you. Introduction 1011A, sponsored by Majority Whip Sylvina Brooks Powers, would require the city's Human Resources Administration to develop informational materials on all reduced fare transit programs, such as Fair Fares, and for the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice to distribute the materials to people who have been arrested or issued a summons for fare evasion. I invite the Majority Whip to speak about her legislation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today, I am proud to sponsor Introduction 1011, which seeks to raise awareness about the Fair Fares program among New Yorkers in need. This bill would require the Department of Social Services to send information about the program to anyone the NYPD tickets for fare evasion. No one should be denied, but so many New Yorkers turn to fare evasion so many New Yorkers turn to fare evasion but necessities like food or rent. We need to make every effort not to criminalize New Yorkers with low incomes who seek to access our city's subways. This outreach effort builds on the council's work to invest an additional $20 million into the Fair Fares in fiscal 2024 budget, atop the $75 million already baseline for Fair Fares in fiscal year 23. We also recently negotiated to increase the program's income eligibility standard to 120% of the federal poverty level. Though more than 300,000 New Yorkers are currently enrolled in the program, hundreds of thousands more are eligible to take part. Too many are just not aware of the existence of this program. Fair Fares is a lifeline to hundreds of thousands of residents for whom every dollar counts. And we need to ensure that every New Yorker who can sign up for the program has the chance to do so. I thank Speaker Adrienne Adams for her leadership on this issue. She has been a consistent advocate for expanding Fair Fares over the past several years. I look forward to continuing my work within the Committee on the Transportation and Infrastructure to ensure we expand this program further and promote it as widely as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Introduction 948A, sponsored by Councilmember Farrell Lewis, would expand the scope of certain NYPD reporting and ensure most of existing reports are posted on the NYPD's website, including those on stop, question, and frisk, officer deployment, overtime spending, and other data. Councilmember Lewis could not be with us today, but we thank her for her legislation. Introduction 944A, sponsored by Councilmember Camila Hanks, would enhance current reporting requirements on civil actions filed against the NYPD to resolve a gap in the data. And Councilmember Hanks could not be with us today, but we do thank her for her legislation as well. Introduction 638A, sponsored by Councilmember Althea Stevens, would require an annual report on donations that exceed $1 million in value to the New York Police Department. It would also require information on the programs or projects to which the NYPD applied those donations. Councilmember Stevens is here, and I invite her to speak about her legislation.
I am here. I'm here, and I am actually so proud to be a part of this council that is really taking a look and listening to people in the community who often don't feel heard or seen by their local electeds. And so these packages of bills, it's really my honor to be able to be part of this and part of history. And I just want to say thank you to the Speaker for your consistent advocacy to foster trust and cultivating transparency between city agencies and members of our community. I would like to also acknowledge the Bronx Borough President who introduced this bill during her tenure, and I'm happy to be able to carry this torch across the finish line. By passing this critical law is a step in the right direction in creating transparency within the police department, as it is mandating an annual report on donations exceeding $1 million. We are empowering the public with the knowledge they deserve and the city with the data they need for efficient oversight. This transparency not only holds NYP accountable but also allowing us as strides of public interest and assess the impact of such donations on youth and our broader community. I firmly believe that understanding where those funds are directed is a prominent to ensuring programs and initiatives that are positively influence the lives of our communities. This legislation is significant in our commitment to open dialogue, promoting civic engagement, and strengthening the vital bond between law enforcement and the community we collectively served. Again, I want to thank and say congratulations to all of my colleagues who are passing legislation today.
Okay, Introduction 538A, sponsored by Councilmember Crystal Hudson, which is part of the How Many Stops Act, would require the NYPD to report on instances in which an individual denies an officer's attempt to obtain consent to conduct a search for which no legal justification besides consent exists, and provide information pertaining to the circumstances involved. I invite Councilmember Hudson to the podium to discuss the legislation she's sponsoring today.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity for giving me this. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on the bills of mine that the Council is passing. Today, the Council will pass the monumental How Many Stops Act, a two-bill package that will bring much-needed accountability and transparency to the NYPD. The bills will require police officers to report certain types of interactions with the general public, giving New Yorkers a more complete picture of police interactions with the public. I'm honored to be the prime sponsor of one of the two bills in the How Many Stops Act package, Intro 538, which will require officers to report on any declined requests for searches and enhance existing policies by requiring reporting on whether officers use consent searches to collect DNA and to understand whether officers use interpretation services when seeking consent from people with limited English proficiency. I'd like to thank the Justice Committee, the New York Civil Liberties Union, and Communities United for Police Reform for their tireless work helping to pass these vital bills. I'd especially like to thank the families of Antonio Williams, Alan Feliz, and all others who've experienced police violence. You've heard and will hear more from many of my colleagues today, including Public Advocate Williams and Councilmember Aviles, debunking the misinformation around these bills. But I must say the fear-mongering is shameful, especially when we know the disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx communities and how these bills will provide much-needed data, transparency, and accountability. This package of bills does not require officers to record the interaction between a tourist asking for directions and the NYPD, as has been suggested. It does not require officers to report when they ask a bodega owner how the neighborhood is, and it does not require officers to report when asking a group of young people how they're doing. The How Many Stops Act protects the civil rights and safety of all New Yorkers by ensuring we have data on stops initiated by a police officer, including level 1 and 2 stops, and providing full police accountability by understanding the extent of stops, including when New Yorkers deny providing consent for an officer's search request, or if language interpretation services have been provided for someone with limited English language proficiency. These bills won't require hours of extra paperwork, as reports like these can be done quickly on an officer's smartphone, the same ones they use while standing around on subway platforms. And they won't leave our streets unwatched. The only thing they'll do is accurately recount who is being stopped and how stops are happening. Thank you again to Speaker Adams for her leadership during a historic 2-year session and for championing these challenging yet important bills. Thank you.
Thank you, history maker. Introduction 781B, sponsored by Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, would require the NYPD to report on the justification for vehicle stops. Introduction 585A, sponsored by the Public Advocate, would require the NYPD to turn over body-worn camera footage to the Department of Investigation's Inspector General for the NYPD within 10 days of receiving a request, unless disclosure is prohibited by law. Introduction 586A, sponsored by the Public Advocate and Councilmember Alexa Aviles, and part of the How Many Stops Act, would require the NYPD to publicly report data on police investigative stops of civilians that are categorized as level 1 and 2 stops. Currently, the NYPD is only required to record level 3 or reasonable suspicion stops. But according to the Federal Court Monitor, there's been inconsistency that has contributed to severe underreporting and data gaps. Level 1 stops allow officers to engage in investigative questioning with an objective, credible reason that is not necessarily indicative of criminality. New Yorkers and communities can experience this as being asked for identification or where they may be going by an officer. This is not, as my colleague intimated, this is not when officers have casual conversations or interactions with civilians or community members about their families, their communities, or their weekends. It is not when an officer gives directions to a tourist or asks a local bodega owner about the Knick game or helps someone to get across the street. The NYPD's own training guide makes it clear that these community engagement interactions do not classify as level 1. We even went further to add language to the bill that explicitly exempts them as well. Level 2 stops allow officers to ask more pointed questions based on a founded suspicion that criminality is afoot, permitting them to ask consent for a search that a civilian can decline and walk away from. The federal court monitor in the stop and frisk case and the NYPD's own audits have repeatedly shown that level 3 stops are being underreported, and officer confusion about the levels contribute to this. These audits and reports have also shown continued unlawful stops occurring, particularly in certain communities. Regardless of the level, New Yorkers who are stopped often can't distinguish between levels, and the experience for them can be the same. This legislation would improve transparency and create a uniform standard of reporting on investigative stops. At a time when every officer is issued a smartphone and NYPD maintains advanced technology, this kind of reporting can be completed without added burden. Level 3 stop reporting is already happening on smartphones, and the use of the term paperwork is inaccurate. NYPD indeed offered language changes to this bill to align it with current reporting, and we accepted all of those changes. Again, I want to reiterate how important transparency is to improving public safety and community trust. Unfortunately, there has been significant misinformation about this bill circulated in meetings and media that has created such an inaccurate conversation with people opposing things that aren't even in the legislation. We believe, and we're confident, that there is an opportunity in a collaborative implementation process with the administration and other stakeholders to alleviate the greatest concerns being voiced. Access to this data can help our city and communities become safer. And I just want to be clear, this isn't about individual officer behavior. It's about having the broader data on policing that helps inform public safety policy. I invite Councilmember Williams, and Councilmember Aviles to the podium to speak about this legislation. PA.
I will be called much worse than Councilmember today. It's definitely that's going to happen.
You want to be
down. Thank you, everyone. Peace and blessing, love and light to everyone here. Thank you, Councilman Hudson, for your leadership on this act, and Councilmember Aviles for co-priming this. I want to give a special thank you to the Speaker. I don't think folks understand how difficult it is to be Speaker in general, to be the first Black Speaker leading over a majority woman council is added burden. And over the past few years, there have been things that none of us could have imagined was going to come. And the Speaker has stepped up every single time to make sure the council is doing its job. And I just want to say thank you so much for that, because I know how difficult it is to do that. I also want to say I'm very glad, exceedingly glad, that the bill I hear the admin discussing is not the bill that the council is passing. So I'm very excited about that. For some additional framework, you know, all of the things that we hear is going to happen to the city happens every time we discuss transparency and accountability. It happened, I guess, 12 years ago now, almost 13, when we passed the Community Safety Act. We heard the same things. It never comes to pass, the negative things that are going to occur. And as a matter of fact, after this council passed the Community Safety Act, the city went on a 10-year historic decline in crime until we got to the pandemic. We all agree now, as I've mentioned before, that there were abuses when it comes to the stop, question, and frisk, which is a tool that our officers need. We agree on that because we got data. All of us were able to look at the same data and information. If that wasn't the case, we very likely would not have got to the conclusion we got. As we agreed on that, there was a remedial process put in place to deal with the abuse of stop, question, and frisk. That remedial process highly recommended that we start reporting on all encounters like level 1s and level 2s. That was a recommendation of the remedial process. There was pushback, as you might imagine, because there is now. Then there was a randomized check by the monitor to see what was happening with the stops. That randomized check and research showed, as the speaker said, there was severe undercounting of level 3s, very likely because officers were listing them as level 1s and 2s, which does not need documentation. And so what we said repeatedly is, let's try to get the information on level 1s and 2s, which, as was mentioned, has nothing to do with asking a bodega owner, nothing to do with a tourist asks you questions. If you want to do community policing in the neighborhood, this does not impact that. I invite reporters to look at the language that's in the bill that we explicitly said so, and by the way, sent over to the administration. They rejected it without any other changes. And when it comes to the paperwork being too long, as was mentioned, they requested we add an additional question to the form that they were saying was going to take too long. That really doesn't make too much sense. And what we said, let's get the information we need with the least administrative burden possible. And that's what this bill does. There is no quote-unquote pedigree information. You're not asking for names. You're not asking for address. You're simply looking at demographics, 4 or 5 questions, one of which was recommended to us by the NYPD. We need this so that we're not talking in anecdotes. We're not talking past each other. We simply have the data we need so we can have an intelligent conversation about how best to move forward. We believe these electronic forms, not paperwork, take literally 10 to 20 seconds, a few seconds added on because of the question the NYPD asked us to put on, and can be done in a myriad of times as officers are walking away from the stop, as they're hopefully walking around the neighborhood. It doesn't take long to fill out 10 to 20 seconds of questioning in a police department that has tech, a robo-dog, a robo-cop on the train. We all talk about the gang database that pulls information from everywhere. Their cameras sync up to each other when they're next to each other. When partners are riding in a car, their phones sync to each other, so only one has to record the information. This tech exists already, and we've provided 6-month implementation period so that the tech can match up with how best to do what we're asking PD to do. And all of us will be exceedingly glad to sit down and have a conversation of how we can do that, so that the false information that is now going in law officers' mind, that's coming from admin, can be pulled back, because we want our officers to do their job. And I'll just close with something I said upstairs. Some of the loudest voices in opposition, and I know that there's concern, so people have concern, I understand that, but the loudest vocal oppositions come from communities that don't deal with what many of us deal with on a regular basis, as our communities are sandwiched between very real street violence and very real over-policing that was supposed to have solved the street violence decades ago and haven't. And all of us understand that our law enforcement have a very important role to play, but the more we ask them to do all of the roles, the more our communities continue to be sandwiched with problems, with deaths, with abuse. This is just but one part so that we can help move forward better policing and safer streets at the same time. It is not overburdensome. It is not a whole bunch of questions. It is a simple 10 to 20 second form when it comes to level 1 encounters and level 2 encounters that the remedial process asked us to do when they found that there was abuse with the level 3 stop, question, and frisk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're so tall. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I guess first I'd like to start my comments with expressing condolences to the families who have lost loved ones to police violence in our city and who have fought for decades for police transparency and accountability and who've had to publicly relive their trauma over and over again in the pursuit of justice. If we as a city are doing things that harm New Yorkers, that are proven to disproportionately target certain New Yorkers, that can end up in death, why are we not putting all our energy into pursuing solutions, to getting the data so that we could make better decisions, so that we could do right by New Yorkers? And so this is what Intro 586 and 538 are trying to do in the How Many Stops Act. As my colleagues have mentioned, it is a transparency bill. It is good government. It is actually using data to make informed decisions as opposed to guessing and playing a game of whack-a-mole. When New Yorkers are telling you that they are being harmed and you're like, well, you know, we don't have the data. We should all be pursuing this data with rigor because we want to do better. And if public safety is in fact the goal, then this should be an easy thing to pursue. And as the public advocate mentioned, this is 5 or 6 questions, including one that was added by the NYPD. This is not narrative prose, it's not reams of paper. It is something that can be quickly done and should be done because we want to do better by New Yorkers. We want to repair community relationships, then we should be willing and eager to fill in the gaps so that we can prove where we are going wrong, so that we can fix where things are not right. And so with that, you know, as you have all heard, historically these stops have ranged from repeated harassment of young people and that shame and feeling of guilt that walking while black is a crime in this city, to something as egregious as death because you were driving while black. No New Yorker should experience this. And we know that underreporting and no reporting is a problem. NYPD has admitted it, the Federal Monitor has admitted it, every New Yorker can tell you that. So we are putting forward a solution that has been in the making for many, many, many years. And I'm eager and so thankful to Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, to the Speaker, Adrienne Adams, for your leadership and your conviction, and to all the colleagues who are willing to put forward solutions amid scare tactics, mythology, and unfortunately, what some of us expect is actually creating conditions that make it hard. We shouldn't be creating conditions to block things that are right for New Yorkers. So I hope NYPD will do better and will figure out in a collaborative fashion with us how to make this most efficient, good data that can help us improve public safety for all New Yorkers. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone again, and I have to thank Communities United for Police Reform, the Justice Committee, Center for Constitutional Rights, Vocal New York, Make the Road New York, and so many other groups throughout New York City who have been fighting for this transparency and good government reform bill for a long time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. We're almost there, I promise. And finally, Introduction 549A, sponsored by Public Advocate Williams, would ban solitary confinement in city jails. All people in city custody would have at least 14 hours of out-of-cell time in shared spaces. The new disciplinary process established by this bill would allow temporary separation from the general population in instances where an individual engages in an act of violence in custody. I invite Public Advocate Williams to the podium once again to give remarks on his legislation. We have been working in the council for way too long.
Thank you so much.
To have it.
Madam Speaker, I love you too. I said it on, I'm saying it on live mic, so it's real.
I appreciate
Yeah, no problem. I did want to acknowledge that the other bills, 1244A, 585A, and 780, which are all critical as well. But I know time's of the essence, so I'm focusing on the two that I know folks had a lot of questions on. Thank you. I want to say a shout out Councilmember Caban and Chair Rivera, who are co-primes on this bill, and once again the Speaker for the leadership and the courage of conviction to pass this piece of legislation. After today, hopefully after the council passes, we will finally have a real enforceable ban on solitary confinement, something that people have been talking about for a very long time. And I also want to acknowledge former Councilmember Drum, who was here. It was his bill, and all the work that went into it beforehand has gotten us to here. No matter what terminology you use, punitive segregation, solitary, however you use it, there is isolation that the UN has called torture. And that is what we want to end. We want to make sure that the psychological effects of isolation that is proven is not something that is done anywhere in the city, and hopefully that will expand across the country, because we know that it's torture. We also know that it's ineffective. People who have undergone solitary confinement are more likely to die from opioid abuse 2 weeks after they're released. They're more likely to commit suicide, be involved in a homicide death, and twice as likely to be rearrested. This bill allows for isolation for a time period to de-escalate, and then it allows for separation from the general public to keep the general population safe and to keep staffers safe. There are things that can be done and taken away, like other privileges. There are programs that can be put in place. There's a host of things that can be done to deal with a person who has caused harm to someone while they're in jail. The one thing that we said is we should not use isolation that people have proven is torture as that thing. That's it. It's a framework that allows a lot of movement for the Department of Correction to move to create the restrictive housing that's needed to keep everyone safe. And as we lift up people like Leland Polanco, Khalif Browder, and his mom, and so many, Brandon Rodriguez, and so many others who died because of that isolation, if we want something different, we have to actually do something different. I also want to lift up people who work on Rikers, like our correction officers, who often come from the same neighborhoods as the detainees. They are lifting up very real numbers of violence against detainees, detainee against detainee, also violence against them. There are a lot of women that are unfortunately facing sexual abuse and assault that is not being responded to the way it should be on Rikers Island. It is not safe for anyone. While that is real, it is happening now while they're using solitary and using isolation, so that is not stopping the issues that they are raising. If we want something different, we have to do something different. And we've put in a framework that allows something different to be put in place. It will not solve all the problems of Rikers. I want to be clear about that. But it will stop an isolation and torture that is going on that is not keeping people safe right now. And we believe stopping that, putting other measures in place, will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Public Advocate. This concludes our stated agenda. With that, we will take on-topic questions.
I apologize, I have 3 questions. So first, for the stops, what happens if a cop stops somebody and they walk away before they want to give their race, age, whatever? What happens? Is the cop supposed to force them to give it to them? Second, the tourist part. It was my understanding that if they are supposed to record tourist interactions, I guess if you could just kind of go into detail, so be very clear, so they're not supposed to report police interactions. And then on the solitary confinement bill, beyond the 4-hour separation, if someone is facing life in jail, what happens if they do rape a correctional officer? What sort of punishment is going to be there for that person?
You said a lot right there. So it's okay. For the first one, what I believe often happens, particularly as administration is speaking about this, most New Yorkers don't know what a level 1, 2, 3, 4 stop is. They have no idea what that means as you say it. They have no idea what it means when it's happening to them. And so this actually helps clarify that. The example you gave on someone who's walking away, as a level 1 stop, people can walk away. They have the ability to. Most people don't actually know that. This bill is asking officers to list what they perceive their race and the gender and the other demographics are. So it's not specifically saying you have to ask people for this pedigree information, because we're trying to make this as easy as possible for officers. So we're not trying to create other questions that have to be asked that they may not want to ask.
So you can guess someone's race. That's not going to lead to other issues?
I mean, technically, yes, we're not sure that guessing will occur, but I will say this. What it could get is a perception of a department or officer or precinct that perceives themselves to be stopping a lot of people of a particular race, of a particular gender. That information is also very valuable, because we don't want perceptions to be wrong and lead to bias-based policing either. Again, part of the confusion is what is actually going on. So if it's a tourist, is the officer suspecting that the tourist may be doing something wrong? Is different than if a tourist asks a question. The first one may be level 1, maybe actually be level 2. And the first one is not a level 1. We're really talking about encounters where officers should already right now be turning on their cameras, because they're doing some kind of investigatory question and accusation question. So most of the times when an officer is turning on their camera, which is not the hellos, which is not the how are yous, this 10 to 20 second form is what we're asking them to fill out after that encounter has occurred. And if they happen to be running and ask them a question, we don't want them to stop running to fill out this form. It's something that could be done at the end.
And then the solitary confinement, if someone is facing life in prison.
No one is facing life at Rikers Island or any jail in New York City.
Okay.
Most of the people in Rikers are awaiting trial.
Okay, so you're saying that this would be played out in courts?
Well, I would say this. I wish it would play out in court quicker. The one determinant factor of violence in Rikers is people who are there past a certain amount of time. So the longer you're on Rikers Island, the more likely that you will be involved in a violent crime. The isolation and solitary has nothing to do with that. 80% of the folks who are waiting, are in Rikers are simply waiting trial. The rest are there serving very, very short and small sentences. And a large part of them are actually have mental health issues, which they shouldn't be in Rikers to begin with. CAPS and PACE are two areas where people involved in violence who have mental health issues are in right now. It's very, very successful without solitary or isolation.
Ethan?
I guess this could be for both the public advocate and the speaker. Are you guys expecting the mayor to veto both the solitary bill and the How Many Stops Act? And I guess what happens if that occurs?
Thank you for the question, Ethan. We really don't know. We only know what's been, told to us in the media. So this is pretty much, we're going to wait and see what happens. We would certainly hope not. If it does play out, then we follow the same procedure that we did when the instance of veto happened last time.
Bernadette and Somerville?
We're heading into an election year next year. Crime, of course, has been the #1 issue that Republicans have specifically lobbied against Democrats. Are you worried that this will imperil Democrats, especially in the congressional races that national Democrats want to try to win back in next year's elections? And then also, other vulnerable city council members who saw crime be a massive topic in this year's cycle. And then my second question is, was this impasse could you just not get anywhere else? Like, why now? Why not wait a little bit longer? The mayor's already signaled that he might veto. Was there just no other way that you guys could negotiate with the MID and the mayor's office to bring this bill, or specifically the public advocates stop accounting bills, to a place where both parties could be happy?
Okay, I'll tackle the first one. I'll give the second one to the public advocate. As far as elections are concerned, and Republicans perhaps using crime statistics in New York or wherever else, and polls as a tool, I would advise anyone running to once again produce facts, because again there is so so much misinformation out there when it comes to statistics of crime in New York City. I would encourage any Democrat that is running to make sure that they have their ducks in a row and can produce the facts to combat the rhetoric that is often just untrue about crime statistics in New York. The other piece, you meant the top of the second question. Okay. I'll start the answer and then I'll give it to the PA to complete. Negotiations with the bill were many, many months. I dare say pretty much, a half a year or so in negotiation with the administration, the NYPD. NYPD had a lot of input in this legislation. That's something else that nobody's speaking about also when speaking about this bill. There was a lot of information. The public advocate just told you all about portions of this bill that the NYPD put in there that wasn't even in there, from the city council at all. So I'll let Jumaane.
Some of the loudest voices against the bill also were the loudest voices in spreading misinformation about crime in the previous election. So my hope is that they will learn the lesson as we go into election and not do that again, because while if you're a victim of crime, it means absolutely nothing to you what data says. But we have to look at the data to say that actually we are, in comparison to most cities across the country, relatively safe. But we want people to be safe and feel safe. And if you're going to spread information that's wrong, then we have outcomes that some of us don't want. So I'm asking folks not to do that. The negotiations, as was mentioned, were long. They get even more intense as you get into what's called the aging period, where we do a lot of back and forth with text. One of the problems is what we kept hearing back from the administration is they don't want level ones at all. And the reason that we had to include level ones is based on what the monitor was saying. Most folks are not doing the level threes the way they should, saying that they're level ones and twos. And so if we left level ones out, what we suspect would happen is we would not get the data we need because people would then say it's level ones. And so we said, let's just include in everything that we can. And literally, the question came down to, can you tell us how best to get this information? Not that we don't need it. So on that question, we never could get that information. We did get a lot of other changes, and we put those changes in. When we put the final language that literally says that this is not for casual interaction in community, we were hoping to address the concern that they had. They simply dismissed it out of hand and did not give any additional text. So we did all that we could to try to negotiate in as good faith as possible to get the information that everybody agreed with, particularly when we had the remedial process. And so what I would ask the mayor as he's thinking about this is think about the work he did as head of the 100 Blacks in Law Enforcement and what would he have done at that moment in time.
Thanks. Back to the veto question, Speaker, and then I have a other question on the how many stops bill. There was another veto earlier this year, as you know, on the city FEPS package. That resulted in an override, something that hadn't happened in years and years and years. Now we're looking at potentially 2 more vetoes. What does this say about the council's working relationship with the mayor in general? Is it just completely falling apart?
No, absolutely not. And I would say that what this says is that we are absolutely maintaining the check and balance, one side of City Hall and the other side of City Hall. So exactly the opposite of what you just said. The fact that we can speak to the needs of all New Yorkers and have that perspective on the council, do our work, and I'm just, change is difficult. It's very, very difficult to implement change to certain standards that have been around for decades. It's difficult to implement change when it comes to perhaps long-term thought as to when we look at housing situations. The housing situation in the city of New York has been horrendous for decades. We want to implement change. So that is a difficult thing for some, to project. So I would dare say that no, relationships between the council and the administration are certainly not falling apart. It's just that there are differences, and there will continue to be. There are supposed to be, and to me, that is healthy work.
And on the many stops act. I was wondering, the 10 to 20 second form, as you described it, like what specifically are the questions in that? And then I just wanted to bring up a scenario, and you can tell me if that would apply as a level 1 or level 2 stop. If a crime has occurred, outside the bodega, and an officer goes up to the bodega owner who might have witnessed something, would that need to be documented?
Well, that will probably be documented anyway. So before this bill is even in place, because they need to get the information from the bodega.
And on the 10 to 20 second.
So the questions are about demographics. There's a question of what precipitated the stop, whether it was a 911 call, whether it was a shooting. There's a question that is a little bit narrative of more information about what the stop was about, and that was a question they asked us to put in, actually. And then, did it lead to another level stop? Like, did it lead to a 3, lead to a 4?
And then actually, that brings something up. Ultimately, this is going to land in the hands of NYPD officers, right? So even if you and the council contend that this should only take 10 to 20 seconds, the cops say that it's going to take a lot longer.
Well, the cops haven't said that. The administration
The mayor has
said it. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And in the event that police officers do end up taking longer than 10 to 20 seconds, is there some sort of mechanism for monitoring that, making sure that it takes less time and doesn't take away from their work?
We can ask that question about anything. So we can ask it about the 250s. We can ask them how long it takes to write summonses, the paperwork they have to do after, the tagging of body camera footage. So what you're talking about is management, and that is NYPD that has to answer those questions. We had very specific ways that can happen as simple as possible. The council cannot dictate exactly how they do it. And so every time we put forth, you can do this the easiest way possible, what they would do is put forth the hardest way possible, I believe, an attempt to stop the bill from passing. So when we said this is a drop down, like 20 seconds on the smartphone, they said it's paperwork. When we say if you're asking a bunch of people at the same time a question, why don't we have one form instead of 23 different forms so that you can have a mass questionnaire that takes less? They didn't respond to that. They just kept saying how much paperwork it's going to be. So we have very clear ideas of how you can do this as simple as possible. They have never said that they can't do it. My hope is that instead of talking about vetoes after these bills pass, hopefully in the council, that we can start talking about the implementation. The reason that we didn't have it start right away is because there are all these kind of questions that we want to make sure is answered and does the thing that we want without causing different problems that we don't want. In order for that to happen, we should sit down and talk about the implementation. But it is PD that has to implement it. The council just gets to pass what the law is. They can choose the easiest way. Why you wouldn't, I don't understand. But also what is troubling is the thoughts that they're putting in police officers' minds now unnecessarily causes confusion that we just don't need to cause. And so we're asking, at least let's just have an honest discussion about what we disagree about, not make a bunch of stuff up that's not even in the bill.
Going off of what Morgan was asking before is a scenario, which I realize, everyone's pretty tough, but there are some incredibly violent people on Rikers. And, you talk to critics, you talk to the admin or COBA, and they'll say, have people in PSH or in some of these units that are dedicated for violent people threaten a correction officer multiple times, be violent to a correction officer multiple times, and then after that 4-hour period, what happens? You can't do anything necessarily to that person.
That's not true.
For longer. So, yeah, what is your response to
So
that? In addition, just one other part, is the admin says that they don't have solitary on Rikers Island, so can you respond to that?
Well, they do, and we've heard that there's people right now dealing with solitary conditions. So one is they absolutely have spaces that people are held in for much longer than they should be, 23 hours a day. It's used as punishment. The things that you described are happening right now, and so we're trying to figure out how to stop that from happening. You can do a lot to a person that is being repeatedly violent. There's also just to be clear, the department can ask for waivers at any time to the board if they have special cases. So all this really does is set the framework of which to work off of. And so to pretend that they can't still ask for waivers is one thing. But I also want to be clear that they do have solitary, but let's pretend that they didn't. By their own admission, we're literally talking about a difference in hours. So what they're saying is that the hours out is what the problem is. So they have a housing unit that's 7, 10, 12 hours out. We're saying that should be 14. So by their own admission, we're simply talking about how many hours a person should be out. And what the UN has told us is that people should be out of the cell if they're awake, because if they're not, that's when the psychological damage comes in. So that question applies to even what they can do right now with their own admission. And we're simply just changing the paradigm of the hours in. We're not changing the other things that they can do. We're not changing the ability they can separate them from general population. They can take away privileges. They can add programming that we know works, like in caps and pace. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and they can get rearrested. And so there's other things that can be done as well. I would say where there's complete agreement in everybody on this issue is that a speedy trial is probably the best thing that we can do for people on Rikers Island, and having less people on the island, it would be helpful.
So on the How Many Stops Act, I just had a question about, we're going back to the level 1 stops. We're talking about stops that the public can walk away from, kind of relying here on the ignorance of the public, knowing that they can just walk away, or not knowing they can just walk away. And kind of on the assumption here, right, of officers assuming what demographics are, or anything like that. So I guess my question here is, we're looking at this data, we're saying this should be an educated conversation, right? Well, what's the benchmark here to have this educated conversation? We have six little fine points that we're looking for, but if 50% of the database is incomplete, that's not telling us anything about half of the stops. So I'm kind of at a loss here. I know level 2 and up, you require statements, so you'll get at least the most accurate information that we can obtain with human error. But with level 1, it seems like there's going to be wildly inaccurate information out there. So is there a benchmark here that the NYPD needs to hit to actually be able to have a proper analysis of this? And what does that look like? And what are we looking like if we come back in 6, 7, 8 months, 10 months to a year, whatever, and it's 20% because everybody walked away or they made assumptions on this?
I don't think that we'll ever have all the complete data of anything, even what's on the books right now. And so very often you have to look at quote unquote bad data, which is the best available data. Right now, we don't have the best available data because we're not asking for the data that the remedial process asks us to do. A lot of this is sometimes assumption. Officers have to make decisions right when the thing is happening. We're not changing that. And we're setting a framework of which we can just get some additional data so that we can try to make some better decisions. But based on what the monitor said, right now, they're already undercounting the level 3. So that's happening right now. We're just trying to set a benchmark that collects all of the data that we have and can get so that we can look at it. If people walk away, they walk away. Most folks don't know they can walk away, so they'll probably stay. And they fill out the demographics to the best of their ability. And we all take a look at that and then make a decision. I'd rather look at that data and come to a decision, even if it's the one you said, or come to a different decision, than have no data at all and we're all talking anecdotally, even as people are telling us what they're feeling on the ground, because that's what happened when the quota system was attached to the level 3s. And we might not have believed them if we didn't actually have the data that shows the kind of stops that were happening.
But doesn't that speak counter to the narrative of, isn't it going to be more interactions with those things with people not knowing their rights?
I'm not understanding the question.
Well, that people can walk away from this.
Yes.
The whole level 1, to get the best data, the whole argument here is to rely on the fact that people don't know that they can't give that. They don't have to give it.
No, that's not it at all. To get the best data is to try to see what officers are doing on the ground when they're interacting with people. So it's really trying to figure out the aggregate data of the officers in the interaction of people. It is a different set of questions to try to educate the public to know that they can walk away, but those are two separate things.
And is there a benchmark then? So the 6 questions, like, if an officer has 2 or 4 and only fills out, only fills out 2 or 4 of those characteristics, is that okay?
Well, he or she should probably fill out the form particularly the question the PD asked for. And they probably have similar things with 250s. We hope that everybody fills out the entire forms. Sometimes they probably don't. If you're asking me the question, is all of this is going to happen perfectly? It's probably not, but nothing does. Everything that we're doing right now doesn't happen perfectly. What we're trying to do is raise the bar for the information that we can bring in. We can only do that if we have some kind of framework to get that information. Right now we have zero, we have none, we have nothing to look at when it comes to level 1s and level 2s.
Just a question for the speaker. Actually, I have two questions. But first, you mentioned the process for veto override earlier. I was wondering if you could just clarify if you would like the council to pursue a veto override if the mayor doesn't veto these two bills.
Well, that's a pretty easy question for me to answer. With all the work that it's taken to accomplish this legislation, the answer to your question would be yes. Is there a part two?
Yeah. I just want to follow up on something Vern asked you. Do you think that how many stops bill is going to put any of the more moderate members in the council in an uncomfortable position with their districts? And what would you say to anyone who might feel that way?
I think that all of us have dynamics to work through with our districts. And the comfortability really depends on the communication. I would ask, and I do this for myself all the time, NYPD should always be a partner to elected officials. And the lines of communication between elected officials and NYPD should always be open, should always be frequent. I had a meeting 2 weeks ago in my district office with NYPD brass, community leaders, CMS. Those communication lines are always open. I would encourage all of my colleagues to do that. Those that may have, let's say, some friction over this legislation, I would encourage them to have open minds about what this legislation is really speaking to and what it isn't. This legislation is not put in place to penalize NYPD. This legislation is put in place to recognize some issues with NYPD in some communities. I don't think anybody has a question about that. So I would ask my colleagues that do have a little trepidation about it to see both sides. I understand the need to look at it in one way because we do have diverse communities. We've got different ways of thinking. We've got different, ways of, of life, in our communities in New York. But I would ask my colleagues who, again, may have an issue with this legislation to be fair in their assessment and to be fair when speaking with their constituents.
Thank you all. We have stated together.
Thank you all. This was long.
Kevin said we still got stated.
Still got stated?